So today I'm going to talk about the question, what really is the best way to learn a new programming language? And honestly, that's not going to be the only thing we talk about. This is actually going to be about learning in general in relation to software development. But let's just start there with learning the best way to learn a new programming language. That is a question that comes up a lot. A lot of people who are new to programming, or maybe they're not literally new, but they're relatively new. They want to learn how they should approach learning a new programming language. And maybe that's because they want to be able to learn it very quickly. They want to be able to get started building something with it as soon as possible. So they want to know the best way to go about it so that they can take a shortcut, and I mean shortcut in a very good way, to actually get to their goal. But really, that let's take a look at that question. Let's analyze it a little bit and see that the answer is probably a lot more nuanced than what most people are looking for. First of all, everyone learns differently, and people are different in their approaches. So you'll have some people who will, if they want to learn something new, they're not even going to get started at their first attempts until they have read the whole library that's available on the topic. Well, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but you're going to have people who put way more emphasis on taking in information and then very cautiously get started at the end. Then, on the other hand, you're going to have people that get a tiny bit of information and then get started right away, and maybe they'll take in some more info, or maybe they won't. Though, I mean, practically speaking, they'll have to take in at least a little bit more to get much past hello world. But there are two styles here. There's another style where there's a little more balance, but either way, you're already seeing that people are different. Some people feel more comfortable just diving in. Other people need more time to fully process the concept before they can dive in. And other people are in the middle. They might take in a good chunk of information and then dive in and do something with it, and then go back and take in another chunk of information and then go from there. So, and that's just one of the ways that people are different. There's also, if you look into learning styles, some people learn by doing, some people learn by listening, some people learn by watching, by visual cues, charts and graphs and pictures and examples. And so there's just so much variety in the individual person that there is really no one way to answer that question. So instead, I'm going to talk from my experience, which I feel like could be valuable. It's at least a starting point for many of you out there. But keep in mind that you likely will have to modify my approach to match the way that you personally learn. So, the way that I learned programming is a variety of ways. My preference, if I'm learning a new programming language, is to take in a good chunk of the information and then dive in and just start building it. Even if I don't fully understand what I'm doing, if I kind of understand it, I'm ready to go. But I've actually been in different situations where I've had to apply different approaches, including when I first got started in programming. I was handed a Perl script that had a bug in it, and I was asked to fix the bug. Great, no problem. Except I had never seen Perl before, ever. Never taken a tutorial, and up until that moment, I had never heard of it. At that time, I knew JavaScript and I knew Visual Basic, but not Perl. I think I knew a little bit of C++ as well at the time. This was years ago, so it's hard to remember that far back, all of the specifics, but I had never seen Perl, never heard of it. And I was given this Perl script that to me seemed pretty big because this was my first venture into production software. Now, granted, looking back, the script was actually relatively small because since then I've been working in much larger applications. But at the time, it was the first time I had worked with production code, and I'd never seen Perl before. And so I was suddenly in the situation where I needed to learn a new programming language. Now, in that instance, what did I do? I knew absolutely nothing besides general programming principles, and I just dove in. Why? Because that was the circumstances. The circumstance was understand what's going on in this code, understand what's not working right, and fix it. And I felt like because I knew general programming, that I knew enough to get started. And so I did. I combed through every line of that code and with the intent of understanding every single line. And then from that understanding, then I could start trying to figure out what might go wrong. And it worked. I did find the bug, I did fix it. And after that, my boss wanted me to start working on more Perl scripts. So they reimbursed me to buy some Perl books and to actually learn it properly. And then after that, I went on to create a whole bunch of Perl scripts to automate jobs for a whole bunch of people at this bank. But yeah, my first attempt at Perl was just dive in. I just dove in with very little knowledge and still accomplished the task. But looking at that, I needed to get some knowledge in order to actually fix the bug. And so, how I did that was I used what I had, which was basic programming principles, and used that to look at the line of code and ask myself, what does this line mean? What does this block of code right here mean? And I made notes and got a decent understanding of what the script was doing. And from there, it was sort of a translation process of I'm looking at the Perl syntax, but I'm translating it into a kind of pseudocode that I can understand. And then I'm looking at my pseudocode and figuring out what the bug is and how I can fix it. And using the rest of the code, I was able to figure out the correct syntax as well for that bug fix. But that's just one method, and that's probably not the most ideal way to learn, but it works. And it just shows that when you have very little resources, very little previous experience, you still are not really starting from nothing. You have your basic programming knowledge, you have your ability to think through problems, you can analyze something, break it down into smaller pieces, and that way you're going to have zero resources, zero tools, but you're still learning and it's still successful. And like I said, after that, I did purchase some books on Perl, and I went through the entire book and did all of the exercises. So this was a more standard way of learning, and it really filled in all of the gaps that I had from just looking at a Perl script and thinking that I understood Perl. Well, I did, but only to a very limited extent. But then there's something that I found when you're using this method. If you're going to a book and going step by step through all the tutorials, it's important to go a little bit beyond. So you do a tutorial, and I'm going to oversimplify this because it makes it easier to explain. If you're doing a tutorial that is leading to you creating a Hello World program, which is literally just printing to the screen the words Hello World, the most simple thing you could possibly do in a program. Well, I guess I would argue there are technically things you could do that are more simpler, but the Hello World program is the traditional way that you get started with any programming language that you're learning. So let's just take that example. You go through the tutorial, you successfully do your Hello World program, just as the tutorial says, you passed. You're not done yet. You need to make sure you fully understand the concept. Just because you followed the steps, you did the exercise, it worked, doesn't mean you're going to actually retain that information and be able to use it on a real world project. So, and like I said, this is an oversimplification, and this will seem kind of silly in the instance of a Hello World program. But you want to take the concepts that you learned from that exercise and do something different. Experiment. So, in this case, oversimplification, you might go from printing Hello World to printing something else to screen, such as, hey, cats are cool. Or maybe you want to print a series of things to screen. So you might expand it just a little bit, just so that you can practice the concepts that you just learned, and you can create something new using those concepts, which makes it where you're more likely to be able to go jump onto a project and do that same thing in a real life project. And so, like I said, once again, and I've said this way too many times, and yeah, this is probably too much repetition, but that is an oversimplification. But the principles there are true. That applies to more complex tutorials. So once you get way past the Hello World stage and you're actually digging into the meat of the language and you're getting to some more complicated problems that you're trying to solve, now it's even more important to experiment, to take those concepts and to do something at least slightly different than what the tutorial had you doing. That way, you didn't just go through the motions, but now you have an understanding of the concept, you know how to use it, and you've applied it to something else and created something new. And so that's something that I would very much suggest if you're learning, is to experiment, try new things. Even if you're going the more traditional route through a book or an online tutorial, you need to go beyond the lesson plan. And the other ways, of course, of learning, you could always learn from fellow programmers, and that's an excellent way to learn. And that's one thing that I learned in my whole career of programming. When I started out, I was at a bank, and for the longest time, I was the only programmer. So I didn't have anyone to really learn from. I had my books, I had the internet, I could go search for things. I could look at other people's code, like in the case of looking at that original Perl script, but I didn't have another person that was more experienced that I could actually learn from. And way back then, I thought that was okay. I thought, yeah, I'm great at learning on my own. I can do this. I can just learn all the things and be an awesome programmer. And in a sense, to a degree, you could say that was correct. I was able to learn quite a bit on my own. I was able to create programs that were very useful to other people, that really sped up their jobs, gave them a lot of value. But I was missing out on something. I was missing out on seeing other ways of doing things. I was missing out on getting other perspectives, which is kind of a big deal because sometimes, and this is just one little example of how that could be a problem, if you are working on a problem, you're writing some code, you've been writing it for hours and hours and hours, and you finally figured it out, you have it working, you're too committed to your solution to see just how lacking your solution is. It works. You got there. It took you a long time to get there. You solved so many problems to get there. And so now you found it and you're not seeing the flaws. But another perspective, another programmer, even someone less experienced than you, can look at your solution and find all the flaws and make suggestions on how you could improve it. Is that because they're a better developer than you? Maybe, maybe not. Likely it's because that person wasn't so invested in this problem. They weren't so invested in the solution that you came up with. They're looking at this with fresh eyes from a new perspective, and they're able to see where you messed up and where you could improve it. And so it's kind of the same way with programming in general. If you're the only programmer and you have no one to learn from, you've been solving problems on your own, you've been figuring things out, you're getting things done. It's great, but you're lacking that other perspective. You're not having someone point out areas where you could improve. Something that could help in that situation is to read books. There's a lot of books out there about becoming a better programmer. One is, I think there's one called Clean Code. I know there's a really famous book that talks about how to write clean code. I can't remember at the moment if it's actually called Clean Code or not. There's a Code Complete. There's a lot of different books that you can go look at that can help you to evaluate what you're doing as a programmer and to make improvements. Those books do give you another perspective, but it's also helpful to work with developers in the real world and to get those perspectives in real time from people you actually know, or maybe you don't know them if you're on an open source project, but having multiple perspectives can make you a better developer. Like, for example, in the case of reading a book about clean code, you're going to learn the ideal way of doing something in the ideal situation. But there are times, and I've been thinking about doing a video on this, but there are times where you actually want to break the rules. And if all you have is a perspective from someone writing a book on how you should do clean code, you're not going to have all these other perspectives on when you should break the rules. And so you might come up with your own opinion on that, and that might get you somewhere. But having other people working on the same project that are able to comment on your code can help you to get those other perspectives, see when you can clean your code up, when, okay, this is technically really clean code, but it's causing problems because of this, and maybe this is a time you break the rules type of deal. Is like, whatever the perspective is, getting all of those perspectives will help you. And that's actually something that I found when I finished my work there at the bank as the only programmer and joined a company and worked with other developers. I did notice that I grew as a developer. I started to understand how to solve more types of problems, I started to understand different ways of doing things. I understood the value of communication because my code needed to be clear so that the other developers I worked with knew what was going on whenever they jumped in. And I felt the same way too. If another developer had worked on some code, when I jump in, I appreciate it if the code is easy to follow. And so that's something else. You learn how to communicate, which is valuable both inside the team and also with your clients. But then when I worked on a team that had very talented developers, and there was a lead that had a lot of experience, especially in coming up with a more ideal architecture and coming up with here's a good path to get there, especially because that code base had a lot of problems starting out. But I worked with someone that was really good at seeing the problems in the code base, knowing what the ideal architecture was, but then also knowing what the intermediate steps were to get there. How much should we improve this without wasting time? Because there's business decisions involved in this. No one wants a developer to go refactor the whole thing and the business owner doesn't see any benefit from it. So you do have to go step by step by step for that reason, for business reasons, but also because a massive refactor could be dangerous. You could introduce so many bugs, break something that was technically working, maybe a little bit buggy, but if you do it step by step by step by step, then you're improving your code base, you're reducing the bugs, and you're not introducing a bunch of potential new problems. And so I feel like my time working with someone who was way more experienced than I was really accelerated my growth as a software engineer. And so that's why I would say that way of learning, that third way of learning from other developers, is very valuable. If you don't have a way of doing that on your team, go check out an open source project. A substitute for that is, yeah, read some books, but that's kind of a poor substitute. It is best if you can work with other developers on a team, especially if they're more experienced, but also keep in mind you can learn from developers that are less experienced as well. So moving aside from that, that's an excellent way to learn. Another way of learning, and it's not really another way of learning, but it's another aspect of learning, is not just learning programming languages. And I know that I've already strayed from learning programming languages because I was talking about learning ways of refactoring and moving towards a better architecture. But that really highlights the point is it's not all about learning a new language. There are so many things that you can learn when it comes to programming, whether it's how to effectively refactor, how to improve performance. Maybe you want to learn more about big O notation. Maybe you want to learn more about data structures. It doesn't matter what you're trying to learn. Maybe it's you're just trying to learn how to communicate better with your colleagues or how to understand your client's needs better. Whatever it is, those same principles can be applied. So I started this video with a question: what is the best way to learn a new programming language? And kind of explored how that's really not a question that you can answer without nuance, and how learning programming doesn't stop at the language. And it doesn't stop with experience either. You can become an expert, but you're guaranteed to keep needing to continue to learn. Not only because technology is constantly changing. I mean, now we have things like AI, there's AI tools, there's, aside from that, even before AI, there were new languages, new frameworks, there were new ways of doing things. There's always something new, but even aside from that, there's so much information in the programming world that you likely don't even know every single thing that already exists. So even because of that, you're going to be going through continuous learning. Also, each problem you face as you're building software is going to be somewhat different. Maybe it's the difference is the client is different. Maybe there's just one little specific thing about this code base that makes this problem different from one that on the surface seemed exactly the same. But no matter what the case, you're going to have to keep learning. But just keep in mind, people learn in a variety of ways. There's a variety of methods. Just use whichever tool that you have access to and tweak it to match you, and just keep going. So that being said, I will wrap this up by inviting you to put any ideas you have in the comments. If you found something especially helpful for learning, or if you have a topic that you would like to hear about, put it down in the comments, and see you next time.